$30,000. That's how much Robert, a 60-year-old American businessman, lost in just 2 hours in Rio de Janeiro. And worst of all, he thought he was simply returning to his hotel in a regular Uber. I'll tell you every detail of this story that will shock you, and believe me, the outcome is even more surprising than you imagine. But before we begin, if you don't want to fall prey to scams like this during your travels, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. And please don't leave the video, because this story has a twist you won't believe. Robert Johnson was one of those American entrepreneurs who breathed technology. By his 60s, he had already sold 2 startups and was always on the lookout for new investment opportunities. His digital innovation consulting firm took him around the world, and Brazil had been on his radar for months. The country represented an emerging market full of potential, especially in Rio de Janeiro, where major technology events frequently took place. It was in March that Robert finally decided to take his first trip to Brazil. He had been invited to an international startup conference taking place in Barra da Tijuca. The trip promised to be rewarding not only for the professional contacts, but also for the opportunity to experience the famous Brazilian hospitality and the natural beauty of Rio. Robert arrived at Tom Jobim Airport on a Thursday afternoon. Like any well-informed American tourist, he had already downloaded all the necessary apps: Uber, iFood, Google Translate with Brazilian Portuguese, and even studied some basic Portuguese phrases on Duolingo during the flight. He was meticulous like that, always preparing for every detail of his business trips. The transfer from the airport to the hotel in Copacabana went perfectly. Robert was impressed by the city views along the way, especially when he spotted Christ the Redeemer in the distance. The Uber driver was polite, spoke basic English, and even offered some restaurant recommendations in the area. Everything looked exactly as Robert had imagined it would. For the first 2 days, Robert had a typical executive experience on a business trip: morning meetings, lunches with potential local partners, and in the afternoon, he took the opportunity to explore the city. He walked around Copacabana and visited some tourist attractions near the hotel, always using Uber to get around. Every trip went perfectly: clean cars, polite drivers, fair prices. On Friday, Robert had his most important meeting at the headquarters of a major technology company in Copacabana. The meeting lasted all morning and continued into the early afternoon. They discussed a potential partnership that could be worth millions of dollars. Robert left the meeting euphoric, already envisioning the business possibilities that lay ahead. It was exactly 3:30 in the afternoon when Robert decided to return to the hotel. He was on Avenida Atlantica, near the Copacabana Palace, and wanted to rest a bit before the conference that would take place that evening in Barra da Tijuca. The sun was strong, typical of a Rio summer day, and he preferred not to walk to the hotel in the heat. Robert grabbed his iPhone and opened the Uber app. As usual, he checked his location, entered the address of his hotel in Ipanema, and requested a ride. A car was found immediately: a black Chevrolet Onix, license plate REO 4587. The driver's name was Carlos. He had a 4.8-star rating, and he would arrive in 3 minutes. Everything was completely normal, exactly as in the dozens of rides Robert had already taken around the world. While waiting, Robert took the opportunity to check his emails. There were a few messages from his team in the United States and a confirmation from the hotel about checkout the next day. He was relaxed, thinking about the promising deals he had discovered in Brazil and already planning his next trip to the country. The black Chevrolet Onix stopped right where Robert was waiting. He quickly checked the license plate, RIO 4587, exactly as the app showed. The car was clean, without a single visible scratch, and the driver waved amiably through the window. Robert opened the back door and got in, as he instinctively did in every Uber. "Robert?" the driver asked in English with a thick Brazilian accent. "Yes, it's me. Hotel in Ipanema, right?" Robert replied, already settling into the bench. "Perfect, my friend. Welcome to Rio de Janeiro," the man said with a broad smile. He looked to be around 40, well-dressed in a blue polo shirt and shorts, just like many of the ride-hailing drivers Robert had encountered in the city. First time in Brazil? During the first few minutes of the trip, Carlos, as he introduced himself, was extremely friendly. He talked about the sights they passed, recommended restaurants, and even shared some interesting facts about Rio's culture. Robert was impressed by the driver's level of English and his knowledge of tourism. "You work in tech, right? I saw it on your profile," Carlos commented casually as he drove down Avenida Atlantica. "My brother-in-law is also in the field. He works with apps here in Rio." Robert found the coincidence interesting and began to tell him a little about his company and the business he was exploring in Brazil. Carlos showed genuine interest, asking intelligent questions about the American technology market and the opportunities in the country. The conversation flowed naturally as the car headed toward Ipanema. Robert was relaxed, admiring Rio's cityscape through the window. Traffic was light for that time of day, and he estimated he would reach the hotel in about 15 minutes. It was while they were passing through Leme that Carlos received a call. He answered quickly, speaking in Portuguese at a speed Robert couldn't keep up with. Judging by the driver's expression, it seemed urgent. Carlos spoke in a worried tone, gesturing with one hand while gripping the steering wheel with the other. "Sorry, my friend," Carlos said to Robert after hanging up the phone. "Very serious family problem. My mother is in the hospital. They just called me. Do you mind if we stop for a second? It'll only be 2 minutes. I need to take care of something urgent with my brother." Robert, who had lost his own mother 2 years earlier, was immediately moved by the situation. "Sure, no problem. I hope she's okay," he replied, genuinely concerned. Carlos thanked him and turned the car onto a less busy street near the beginning of Copacabana. It was a residential area, with a few old buildings and little pedestrian traffic. He parked near a small square and said he'd be back shortly. Robert waited in the car, taking the opportunity to reply to a few messages on his cell phone. He didn't find the stop unusual. After all, urgent family situations could happen to anyone. In fact, he even admired the driver's dedication to family life. It was exactly 8 minutes before Carlos returned, but he wasn't alone. A younger man, apparently around 30, accompanied him. Carlos opened the driver's door, and the young man walked to the rear right-hand door. "Robert, this is my nephew Diego," Carlos said, sounding a little nervous. "He was waiting at my aunt's house nearby and needs a ride downtown. Do you mind? It's on the way to Ipanema." Before Robert could fully respond, Diego had already opened the door and was getting into the car. "Hi, how are you?" he said in English with an accent even thicker than his uncle's. "Thanks for the ride." Robert found the situation a bit unusual, but he didn't want to be rude. After all, he was in the country as a visitor and wanted to show the same hospitality he had received. "No problem," he replied, moving slightly to give the young man more space. The car started moving again, but Carlos seemed more tense now. He drove more slowly, constantly checking his mirrors. Diego remained silent most of the time, just fiddling with his phone. Robert began to sense something was different in the room, but he still couldn't pinpoint what exactly. This is when you need to check out the Brazil Unlocked ebook. I've created comprehensive material that reveals all the most common scams targeting tourists in Brazil, and most importantly, how to spot them before it's too late. The link is in the video description and in the first pinned comment. Download it now, because knowledge is the best protection against scammers. The trip, which should have taken 15 minutes, was already approaching 25. Robert was growing impatient and questioning whether this route was truly the most efficient way to get to his hotel. Carlos seemed to be taking a longer route, passing through streets Robert didn't recognize from previous trips he'd taken in the area. "Carlos, aren't we going too far?" Robert asked, trying to sound casual, but with a hint of concern in his voice. "Oh, there's just a lot of traffic on the regular route today," Carlos replied quickly. "This way is faster, trust me. I've lived here for 40 years. It was at that exact moment that a third man appeared out of nowhere on the sidewalk, waving at the car. Carlos slowed down and rolled down the window. The man approached. He was wearing a yellow reflective vest and carrying a clipboard, along with a badge hanging around his neck. "Good afternoon. Inspector from the Municipal Department of Transportation," the man said in English, showing Robert his badge. "We're conducting a routine operation checking the documentation of ride-hailing vehicles. May I see your documents, please?" Robert felt the first shiver of suspicion. This seemed too convenient, too coordinated. Carlos, who seconds before had seemed relaxed, now looked visibly nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he searched for documents in the glove compartment. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carlos asked, his voice now noticeably more tense. The alleged inspector examined the papers with an increasingly serious expression. "Sir, these documents contain serious irregularities. This vehicle is not authorized to operate as a ride-hailing service in this region." Robert watched the scene, trying to process what was happening. His experience as a businessman had taught him to recognize suspicious situations, and all the warning signs were going off in his mind. The coincidence was too great. The traffic stop, the nephew, and now a traffic stop just as they were on a secluded street. This means the passenger could also be charged with complicity in illegal transportation, the inspector said, turning to Robert. "Sir, are you a tourist?" "Yes, I'm American," Robert replied, his voice sounding more cautious now. "I understand. Look, this situation could get very complicated for you. Illegal transportation in Brazil is a federal crime. You could have problems leaving the country. You could be detained by the federal police," the man said, shaking his head with a worried look. "But maybe we can resolve this here, in a simpler way." Diego, who had remained silent until then, suddenly joined the conversation. "Uncle, you didn't tell me you had a problem with your documentation. Now everything's screwed up." "Calm down, Diego. Calm down," Carlos replied, sounding genuinely desperate. "Officer, please, can you solve this? I have a family to support." Robert felt his heart racing. The whole situation seemed overly rehearsed, but at the same time he was in a foreign country, didn't speak fluent Portuguese, and the possibility of legal trouble terrified him. His rational mind told him it was suspicious, but the fear of international complications was starting to take over. "Well," the inspector said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, "there is a way to regularize this immediately. It's an emergency fee for express regularization of documents. It costs 3,000 reais, but it resolves the issue immediately and avoids all the bureaucracy with the federal police." 3,000 reais? Robert repeated, quickly making the mental exchange, approximately $600. It was a considerable sum, but not impossible if it were truly necessary to avoid major problems. Carlos seemed relieved at the prospect. "Officer, I'll pay right now if it's possible to resolve it that way. The problem is that the fee has to be paid by the passenger as well," the inspector explained. "Since you were using an illegal service, you need to pay your share of the regularization. That's an additional 3,000 reais. If you've ever experienced any insecurity or psychological pressure while traveling, like this video, and share your experience in the comments. It's important that we share these experiences so more people can protect themselves." Robert felt increasingly pressured. 6,000 reais, approximately $1,200. It was a lot of money, but the alternative presented by the men, possible trouble with the federal police, detention, complications leaving the country, seemed much worse. "What if I don't pay?" Robert asked, trying to buy time to think. "There's no way around it, sir," the inspector replied, shaking his head gravely. "You'll have to accompany us to the police station, file a report, and call a lawyer. It could take days to resolve. And honestly, as a tourist, judges aren't usually very friendly with foreigners who break our traffic laws." Diego began to show impatience. "Uncle, solve this quickly. I can't be late today." The psychological pressure was working exactly as the scammers had planned. Robert felt isolated, confused, and threatened. He wasn't familiar with Brazilian laws. He didn't know if this situation was actually possible, and the fear of legal complications in a foreign country was clouding his normally sharp judgment. "Okay, I'll pay," Robert finally said, his voice holding resignation. "How do I pay?" The supposed inspector smiled for the first time since he'd appeared. "Perfect, sir. You've made our lives and yours much easier. We can pay by PX or bank transfer. It's faster and already regularizes everything in the system." Robert took out his phone, but when he went to open the banking app, he realized there was no internet signal in that area. "I can't connect," he said, showing his phone. "No problem," Carlos said quickly. "There's a place nearby with free Wi-Fi, just down the street." The car moved a few blocks until it stopped in front of a small cafe. Robert managed to connect to the establishment's Wi-Fi network and access his bank account. He had an international account that allowed transfers to Brazil, facilitating his business in the country. "Officer, what's the transfer information?" Robert asked. The man dictated an account number and PX code. Robert entered the information and proceeded to transfer 6,000 reais. But when he tried to confirm the transaction, a message appeared on the screen informing him that the daily limit for international transfers had been exceeded. "Did something go wrong?" the inspector asked, noticing the worried expression on Robert's face. "My bank blocked the transfer. They have a daily limit for foreign transactions," Robert explained, genuinely frustrated. Ironically, the bank's security measure, which normally protected him against fraud, now seemed to be getting in the way of solving the problem. Diego showed more agitation. "What now? I can't stay here all day." Calm down, the inspector said, thinking quickly. "There are other ways. Do you have an international credit card? We can do it through a cryptocurrency transfer app. It's instant and has no limit." Robert had used cryptocurrencies a few times for his company's international transactions, so the method didn't seem entirely unfamiliar to him. The inspector instructed him to download a specific app and create a digital wallet. "Is it safe?" Robert asked. "Absolutely," the inspector assured. "It's the method the city is now using to expedite these regularization payments. Much more practical than traditional banks." Pressed for time and the situation, Robert followed the instructions. He converted dollars to Bitcoin through the app and then transferred the equivalent of 6,000 reais to the wallet indicated by the inspector. The transaction was completed in a few minutes. "Perfect," the inspector said, checking the receipt on his cell phone. "Now I'll issue you the regularization receipt." He picked up his clipboard and began filling out an official-looking document, complete with Rio de Janeiro City Hall logos and fields for personal information. Robert provided his details: full name, passport number, hotel address. "There, Mr. Robert, everything is in order," the inspector said, handing him the paper. "You can continue using ride-hailing apps as normal. If another inspector stops you, just show this document." Robert examined the paper. It looked legitimate, with stamps and signatures, though he wasn't sure what to look for to verify the authenticity of a Brazilian document. "Now can I continue to the hotel?" Robert asked. "Sure. Carlos, you can take Mr. Robert," the inspector said, saying goodbye and walking towards a motorcycle parked nearby. Carlos seemed to relax immediately. "Sorry about this whole situation, my friend. I didn't know there was a problem with the documentation." Lucky for us, the officer was understanding. The trip to the hotel continued, now with a seemingly more relaxed atmosphere. Diego got off downtown saying a polite goodbye, and Carlos continued on to Ipanema, once again discussing tourist attractions and restaurants. When they arrived at the hotel, Robert gave Carlos a generous tip, and he thanked him profusely. "Thank you for your understanding, Mr. Robert. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Rio." Robert entered the hotel, still mentally processing what had happened. Part of him felt relieved that the situation had been resolved without further complications. But a small voice in his head insisted that something had not been entirely normal about the experience. While we're on the subject of scam protection, don't forget to download the Brazil Unlocked ebook I mentioned. It contains detailed information about this and many other scams that occur in Brazil. The link is in the description and in the first pinned comment. It's a resource that can literally save your money and your trip. It was when he lay down on the bed and picked up his phone to check his emails that the first real suspicion began to emerge. He opened the Uber app to check his ride history and found something that completely confused him. The ride he had requested from Avenida Atlantica to the hotel showed up as canceled by passenger at 3:37 p.m., just 4 minutes after it was requested. But he had never canceled that ride. "This doesn't make sense," Robert muttered to himself, staring at his phone screen. He tried to understand what could have happened. Maybe an error in the app. But then, if the ride had been canceled, how had Carlos received the request? And why did the car and license plate match exactly what appeared in the app? Robert decided to call Uber support. After a few minutes on hold, he was answered by an employee who spoke fluent English. "Mr. Robert, I see here that you requested a ride at 3:33 p.m. today, but it was automatically canceled by the system at 3:37 p.m. because there was no nearby driver available," the attendant explained. "But I got in a car, made the whole trip," Robert said, his voice starting to show concern. "That's impossible, sir. If the ride was canceled, none of our drivers could have accommodated your request. Are you sure you got into an official Uber?" Robert felt his stomach sink. The license plate was exactly the same as the one on the app, REO 4587. "Sir, please check again. Our database does not show any vehicle with that license plate registered on our platform in Rio de Janeiro." Robert's world began to crumble at that moment. He hung up the phone and sat on his bed for a few minutes, trying to process the information he had just received. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in his mind. The car wasn't a real Uber. Carlos wasn't a ride-hailing driver. The inspector wasn't a city employee. Diego wasn't anyone's nephew, and he had just transferred the equivalent of over $1,000 to scammers. With trembling hands, Robert opened the cryptocurrency app where he had made the transfer. He tried contacting technical support, but discovered that Bitcoin transactions are irreversible. Once sent, there is no way to retrieve them. Desperate, he tried calling his credit card company to report the fraud, but discovered that since he had knowingly authorized the transactions, it would be very difficult to get a refund. Robert spent the rest of the afternoon trying to fully understand what had happened. He researched scams in Brazil online and found dozens of similar stories. The fake Uber scam was more common than he imagined. Criminals cloned real ride information from the app, license plate, car model, even the driver's name. They intercepted Uber requests in busy areas, canceled the original ride in the system, and showed up with a car identical to the one they were supposed to arrive. "How could I have been so naive?" Robert asked himself repeatedly. The next morning, Robert decided to go to the police to file a report. At the station, the officer was quite friendly but realistic about the chances of recovering the money. "Mr. Robert, unfortunately, this type of scam is very sophisticated," the police chief explained in English. "Criminals use fake documents, rented or stolen cars, and cryptocurrency transfers make tracking nearly impossible." The police report was filed, but Robert knew his chances of seeing the money again were slim to none. But the story doesn't end there. After returning to the United States, Robert discovered that the scammers had used his passport and address information to attempt other types of fraud. They attempted to open bank accounts in his name and even applied for credit cards using his personal information. Fortunately, Robert had signed up for a credit monitoring service that automatically blocked these attempts, but he spent months dealing with the aftermath of the scam. Robert's total loss wasn't just the 6,000 reais transferred that day. Adding up legal fees, identity protection services, and time spent sorting out bureaucratic issues, he estimates he lost the equivalent of over $30,000. The most frustrating part, Robert told me when I spoke with him, wasn't even the money. It was realizing how perfectly they studied my psychological profile. They knew exactly which fears to exploit and how to push me. Now let me give you some essential tips to avoid falling for this scam. First, always check the app to see if your ride is active. If it shows as canceled, don't get in any car. Second, real inspectors never ask for payment via Pix or cryptocurrency on the spot. Third, always be wary of overly convenient situations or exaggerated coincidences. Fourth tip, if you suspect anything, ask to leave the vehicle immediately. Don't be afraid to be rude. Your safety trumps politeness. Fifth tip, always keep in touch with someone while traveling, letting them know where you are and who you're with. And the most important tip of all, trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Robert told me that throughout the entire ordeal, a little voice in his head kept telling him something was wrong, but he ignored it for fear of the consequences. Brazil is an incredible country with wonderful people, but like anywhere in the world, it has its share of scammers. The important thing is to be prepared and informed. If you found this video helpful, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to be notified whenever I post new videos about scams around the world. Also, leave a like if this story impressed you and tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced a suspicious situation while traveling? And don't forget, knowledge is the best protection against scammers. So share this video with friends and family who also travel. The more people know about these scams, the fewer victims criminals will be able to claim. Thanks for watching until the end, and see you in the next video.